What does it truly mean for a nation to rise up on its own? Burkina Faso, a nation long caught in the crossfire of political instability, has seen its fate dramatically shifted by Ibrahim Traoré's leadership. When the country was left to fend for itself, the people of Burkina Faso were forced to confront a harsh reality. They could no longer wait for external help. This was a turning point. Under Traoré's command, the military and the nation's people united with a single purpose: to reclaim their sovereignty. With the world watching, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Would Burkina Faso fall to the forces of terror, or would it rise to defend itself and its future? Traoré's doctrine, "security must come from within," resonated with the people. But it wasn't just a slogan. It became a guiding principle for a nation on the brink of defining its own destiny. The promise was simple yet monumental. Victory meant not only reclaiming territory, but asserting the nation's right to determine its own future. The events unfolding in Boule Dumuhune are more than just a military operation. They symbolize a larger struggle for the soul of a nation. For years, Burkina Faso's vast rural expanses had been left vulnerable, with militants gaining ground as the central government struggled to maintain control. In these remote areas, villages had become ghost towns, abandoned by fear and poverty as terror groups infiltrated at will. But on the horizon, a shift was quietly brewing. Ibrahim Traoré, with his firm belief in self-reliance, began to rally the people. The early stages of the operation were modest, yet the impact was profound. A small but determined unit, the Portable Intervention Force, launched a strike on Boule Dumuhune, a strategic location that had long been under militant control. The first strike came with precision. No fanfare, no warning. Just a coordinated assault that dismantled enemy positions within hours. This was not the chaotic clash of forces one might expect. It was a calculated maneuver, relying on intelligence and swift execution. But it was more than just military prowess at play. The volunteer units, known as the VDP, Volontaires pour la défense de la patrie, were not professional soldiers, but local farmers, merchants, and young men who had lived through the years of terror. They knew the land intimately, and their commitment to defending their homes gave them an edge that no outsider could match. What Traoré and his forces achieved in those first hours was nothing short of remarkable. The militants, once emboldened by their strongholds, were forced into retreat. Boule Dumuhune, once a symbol of defeat, began to show signs of revival. But the true significance lay in what this represented, the first steps toward reclaiming not just land, but dignity and sovereignty. As the military continued its push, the message was clear. This wasn't just about taking back a few villages. It was a bold declaration that Burkina Faso would no longer wait for outside forces to define its future. The national spirit was alive once more. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership was not defined by grand speeches or sweeping promises. Instead, it was rooted in the quiet determination of a nation determined to redefine itself. As the operation in Boule Dumuhune unfolded, it quickly became clear that the path to victory would not be through traditional military might alone. It was the involvement of the local population, people who had once been victims of violence, that would become the driving force of the mission. These volunteers, the VDP, were the backbone of the operation. They didn't wear uniforms or carry the heavy artillery of regular forces. They were farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, people who had been pushed to the brink of despair, but were now finding strength in their unity and resolve. Among them was Amadou, a former teacher turned volunteer. He had seen his community shattered, his school abandoned, and his country's hope fade. But when the call to defend his village came, he stood tall, alongside others who shared his resolve. "This is our home, our future," he often said, his voice carrying the weight of an entire generation's yearning for stability. Together, the VDP and the intervention forces began to secure the perimeter of Boule Dumuhune. Every inch reclaimed was a testament to the resilience of the people. As the days passed, the impact of this collective effort became clear. It wasn't just the insurgents who were being driven out, but the fear that had long gripped the hearts of the people. What began as a military operation was transforming into a movement of national pride. For Traoré, this was the beginning of something much larger. The early successes weren't just about military strategy, they represented the return of agency to the people of Burkina Faso. The nation was beginning to stand on its own, and Ibrahim Traoré was not just a leader. he was a symbol of its rebirth. As the operation in Boule Dumuhune intensified, the rhythm of the nation's resistance began to shift. Ibrahim Traoré's strategy was clear: a swift, targeted campaign to break the back of the insurgents and demonstrate that the people of Burkina Faso would no longer wait for external help. The operation, dubbed Retour aux Racines, Return to the Roots, was not just about retaking territory, it was about reclaiming the sovereignty that had been lost in the years of instability. The first phase saw the intervention force swiftly neutralize the enemy's forward positions. Boule Dumuhune, strategically located at the crossroads of several rebel strongholds, became the focus of the campaign. What the insurgents hadn't anticipated was the speed and precision with which Traoré's forces moved. The military worked seamlessly with the VDP, whose intimate knowledge of the terrain gave them an edge. In a matter of days, key positions were secured and the insurgents began to retreat. But the victory was not without cost. Each engagement was a brutal reminder of the harsh reality of the conflict. The VDP, though brave, faced enormous challenges as they pushed forward. Yet, the momentum they built was undeniable. By the second phase, the battle lines had shifted. What began as a defensive struggle quickly evolved into an offensive one. The insurgents, once confident in their positions, were now in disarray. Their supply lines were severed and their strongholds were falling. But it wasn't just the military action that was driving the insurgents out, it was the people. As word spread that the military had the support of the people, other regions began to rally to the cause. Local militias formed in neighboring villages, and soon the operation was no longer limited to a few key regions. It became a national effort. This wave of support wasn't just a response to Traoré's leadership, it was a reflection of the collective will of the people, who had long been forgotten by the international community. As the forces advanced, the effects on the insurgents were clear. The once boasting militants, who had terrorized the countryside with that were now scattered and disheartened. They no longer had the support of the local population, and their ability to maintain a hold on Burkina Faso's land had all but collapsed. However, the battle was far from over. The insurgents, though on the retreat, were not vanquished. What followed was a series of smaller skirmishes as the forces worked to clear out the remaining pockets of resistance. Despite this, the psychological effect of the operation could not be understated. For the first time in years, the people of Burkina Faso had a sense of control over their destiny. They were no longer passive victims, they were active participants in their own defense. As the dust settled, it became clear that the battle for Boule Dumuhune was not just a military success, it was a profound shift in the country's narrative. Ibrahim Traoré had not only reclaimed territory, he had restored the faith of the people. They no longer viewed themselves as abandoned. They had seen their own strength reflected in the actions of their leaders. This was the moment when Burkina Faso began to truly stand on its own, when the sovereignty of the nation was reaffirmed, and when Ibrahim Traoré's leadership was cemented as a defining force in the country's future. In the wake of the successful campaigns, the hard numbers of victory began to emerge, reflecting the strategic brilliance of Ibrahim Traoré's leadership and the unyielding determination of the people. The military's precision and efficiency were underscored by key statistical milestones, marking the early successes of the operation. Within the first week, over 30 insurgent strongholds had been neutralized, each one dismantled with the cooperation of the intervention force and the Volontaires pour la défense de la patrie, VDP. These strongholds, once the base of operations for terror groups, had long been a symbol of the insurgency's control over vast swathes of the countryside. The loss of these positions, strategically located throughout the Boule Dumuhune region, dealt a decisive blow to the militants. The second critical achievement was the rapid deployment of resources. In a matter of days, over 50 tons of humanitarian aid, food, medicine, and critical supplies were delivered to the newly liberated areas. This swift action not only proved the military's efficiency, but also reaffirmed the government's commitment to rebuilding and stabilizing the nation. The aid distribution was accompanied by the restoration of basic services, including the reopening of schools and clinics, as well as the establishment of temporary local governance structures. These acts of restoration were essential, as they provided tangible proof to the population that the conflict was not an endless cycle but a gateway to renewal. One of the most significant outcomes of the operation was the surge in local recruitment for the VDP. by the end of the second phase, the number of volunteers had increased by 40%, with local militias forming across various regions. The sense of ownership that the people felt in this operation was reflected in their willingness to protect and rebuild their communities. More than 10,000 men and women from all walks of life had joined the ranks, embodying the national spirit of unity and resilience. Meanwhile, the insurgents, now retreating into the vast Sahel region, were grappling with the loss of their once secure supply lines. Intelligence reports revealed a sharp decline in the flow of weapons and ammunition, a direct result of the military's strategic strikes on key logistics hubs. Within a month, these efforts had severely disrupted the insurgents' capacity to sustain their operations. The seizure of over 200 vehicles and significant stockpiles of weapons further depleted the militants' resources, breaking their logistical chain and undermining their strategic positioning. These quantifiable successes were more than just numbers. They marked a profound shift in the balance of power. The insurgents, who had once believed their presence in the region was uncontested, were now being systematically dismantled. Traoré's leadership had not only resulted in military victories, but had also demonstrated that the people of Burkina Faso were capable of defending themselves and securing their future. The impact was clear. The insurgents were in retreat, the military had strengthened its position, and the people had witnessed the restoration of their sovereignty. For the first time in years, Burkina Faso was moving toward a future that was shaped by its own hand. Ibrahim Traoré's vision was no longer just a concept, it had become a reality. And the numbers proved it. As Burkina Faso's military and civilian forces pushed forward, the situation became a contest not just of arms, but of ideologies. The insurgents, long considered the dominant force in the region, now faced an adversary unlike any they had encountered before, a unified nation, led by Ibrahim Traoré, who understood the stakes far beyond the battlefield. However, as with any military operation, the question arose, could this national effort truly sustain itself, or would the people of Burkina Faso risk being swept up in a cycle of violence that would last for years to come? On one hand, the insurgents had what appeared to be a strong ideological stance. They were fighting for what they considered a liberation from the West, rallying under the banner of anti-colonialism and resistance to foreign influence. They presented themselves as the vanguard of an African revolution, rejecting the interference of global powers. But their methods, terror, displacement and brutality, had alienated the very people they sought to liberate. Their ideological appeal was not enough to keep them grounded in the hearts and minds of the population. As the military advanced, the insurgents found themselves losing not just strategic positions, but the support of the local population, who had grown weary of endless violence. On the other hand, the Burkinabe people, under Traoré's leadership, had no such divisive agenda. Their fight was not against a specific ideology, but for the right to self-determination. They sought nothing more than to reclaim their sovereignty and rebuild a nation torn apart by years of conflict. This was the true power behind Traoré's leadership. He did not rally his people with abstract ideologies, but with a clear, unifying call for survival and independence. His doctrine, security must come from within, was not just a military strategy, it was a philosophy that resonated deeply with the people who had been denied agency for far too long. The distinction between these two sides became ever more apparent as the conflict progressed. While the insurgents relied on fear, manipulation, and a message of resistance, the Burkinabe people's resistance was rooted in something far more enduring: hope. As the military secured more regions and the people saw their homeland being restored, it was clear that the insurgents could not compete with a unified population fighting for its future. Ibrahim Traoré's approach, though initially doubted by some, had proven to be the decisive factor in this conflict. The insurgents' ideal of a forced revolution had failed to take root in the hearts of the Burkinabe people, while Traoré's vision of sovereignty and national unity had given rise to a new sense of national pride. The balance was shifting, and the insurgents, despite their ideological claims, were losing the battle for the people's loyalty. As the operation entered its critical phase, the Burkinabe people were faced with a pivotal moment. Their national identity was no longer a passive notion, but a force in itself. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership had sparked a quiet revolution, not just in the military realm, but in the hearts of the people. The insurgents, who had once seemed unstoppable, were now on the back foot. But the true turning point was not marked by military victory alone. It was the psychological shift within the population that solidified the nation's resolve. In the village of Bonsa, a lone figure stood at the edge of the battlefield, gazing at the horizon. It was a young farmer who had lost everything to the insurgents, his crops, his home, his family's livelihood. Yet as he looked out over the reclaimed land, he felt something new stirring within him. Hope. This was not the hope of distant promises or foreign aid, but the hope of his people standing tall once more. The Burkinab had found their strength not in fighting for an external cause, but in fighting for their own future. For Traoré, this moment marked the true victory. The people had become more than supporters. They had become the very foundation of his movement. The operation's success was not simply in its military tactics, but in the collective will of a nation rising together. The success of the operation in Boule Dumuhune didn't just mark a military victory, it brought about a profound transformation in the country's socio-political fabric. As the insurgents retreated and the military secured more ground, the people of Burkina Faso were left to rebuild their lives. But the battle for their future had only just begun. With key regions now under the control of the Burkinabe forces, the immediate focus shifted from military engagement to the reconstruction of the nation. The government, led by Ibrahim Traoré, moved swiftly to restore order and stability. Within days, essential services such as healthcare, education, and food distribution were re-established. Temporary schools were set up in liberated areas, while local clinics were opened to treat the wounded and the sick. These actions, though small, sent a powerful message to the people. Their government was committed to rebuilding, not just defending. One of the most significant outcomes of the operation was the psychological impact it had on the people. No longer were they seen as victims, they were now active participants in their own sovereignty. The national pride that had been reignited through the successful campaign began to fuel a renewed sense of hope and purpose. The people of Burkina Faso were beginning to take ownership of their future, not just by defending their homes, but by rebuilding their communities. Local leaders emerged, taking charge of rebuilding efforts in their villages. What had been once a region of fear and despair was now a symbol of resilience. But the victory was not without its challenges. While the insurgents had been pushed out, the threat of terrorism was far from over. The insurgents, though on the retreat, were regrouping in neighboring regions, and sporadic attacks continued. Yet, the people of Burkina Faso were no longer passive recipients of violence. They had taken up arms in defense of their nation, and with each successful campaign, they had grown more confident in their ability to secure their own future. The country, once reliant on external aid and foreign intervention, was beginning to forge its own path. International observers watched closely as Burkina Faso navigated these post-conflict challenges. Some saw the nation's newfound resolve as a model for the region, while others remained skeptical. The international community, particularly Western powers, expressed concerns over the growing presence of local militias and the potential for human rights abuses. But for many Burkinabe citizens, these concerns felt distant. Their focus was on rebuilding their lives, and they had little patience for outsiders who had failed to support them in their time of need. The success of the operation was not just a triumph over the insurgents, it was a declaration of independence. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership had sparked a movement that extended beyond the military. It had instilled in the people of Burkina Faso a belief in their own power, the power to reclaim their land, rebuild their country, and define their future. Looking ahead, Burkina Faso's path was uncertain. But one thing was clear: the country had taken the first steps toward reclaiming its sovereignty. As Ibrahim Traoré's government worked to stabilize the nation, three possible scenarios began to emerge for the next 6 to 12 months. Each scenario carried its own set of challenges and opportunities, but the common thread was the determination of the Burkinabe people to shape their own destiny. Scenario 1. Optimistic outlook, a nation reborn. In this scenario, the nation's recovery gains momentum. The government, with the backing of local militias and the national military, continues its reconstruction efforts with increasing efficiency. International aid, though initially reluctant, begins to flow back into the country as the situation stabilizes. Foreign investors, once wary of Burkina Faso's instability, begin to show interest in the country's vast natural resources. The VDP, volontaire pour la défense de la patrie, transition from local militia into a more formalized national guard, providing a stable security framework. This scenario is marked by a strong, resilient economy driven by agriculture, mining, and sustainable development. The government's commitment to building a self-sustaining nation resonates with both local and international stakeholders, and the country enjoys a period of stability and growth. Scenario 2. Cautiously optimistic, a nation at the crossroads. In this more cautious scenario, Burkina Faso begins to rebuild, but the pace of recovery is slower. While the insurgents are pushed out, sporadic attacks continue from militant groups operating in neighboring regions. The government's efforts to stabilize the country are met with mixed reactions, both domestically and internationally. Some regions experience more rapid recovery than others, and local militias struggle to integrate into the national structure. The economic recovery is uneven, and while the agricultural sector flourishes, progress in mining and infrastructure development faces setbacks. The international community, though still cautious, begins to acknowledge Burkina Faso's progress, but foreign aid remains limited. However, the people remain determined, and despite the challenges, there is a collective effort to rebuild the country from the ground up. This scenario is marked by slow but steady progress, with a clear commitment to national sovereignty and self-reliance. Scenario 3. Pessimistic outlook, continued struggles. In the worst-case scenario, the situation in Burkina Faso deteriorates once the initial momentum of the operation fades. Despite the military successes, insurgent groups regroup in the surrounding regions, continuing their attacks on vulnerable areas. The country struggles to maintain the fragile peace, with local militias growing increasingly fragmented and competing for resources. International condemnation grows as human rights abuses and governance issues surface, and foreign aid is once again cut off. The government's efforts to stabilize the country face strong opposition both internally and externally. In this scenario, the economic situation worsens, with widespread poverty and insecurity affecting the majority of the population. The initial victory over the insurgents may turn into a prolonged struggle for survival, with the Burkinabe people caught between the forces of insurgency and an under-resourced government. As the events in Burkina Faso unfolded, one question lingered in the minds of many: how does a nation torn apart by years of violence and instability begin to rebuild? The answer wasn't just found in military strategy or political policies, it was found in the people, in the faces of the volunteers, the farmers, the teachers, and the young men and women who stood side by side with their soldiers, defending their homeland. The Burkinabe people weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for the chance to live freely on their own terms, to reclaim the dignity that had been taken from them. The emotional toll of the conflict was evident. In Bonza, a small village once dominated by fear, a group of survivors gathered to witness the return of their flag, a symbol of both victory and resilience. As the flag was raised high, a hush fell over the crowd, and the weight of their collective history seemed to press down on them. In that moment, there was no longer just a battle for land or power, there was a battle for the soul of the nation. The flag was not merely a symbol of military triumph, but of a people reclaiming their right to define their future. Yet the question still lingered: could this sense of unity and pride survive the inevitable challenges of reconstruction? The answer lay not in what came next, but in the realization that for the first time in decades, the people of Burkina Faso had rediscovered their strength. They no longer looked to the outside world for salvation. They had learned to stand together and defend what was theirs. And in that unity, they found the power to rebuild, to dream, and to live on their own terms. The path forward for Burkina Faso is clear. It lies in the hands of its people, their resilience, and their collective will to rebuild what has been lost. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership has shown the power of self-reliance, but the work of true reconstruction will require collaboration, innovation, and strategic planning at every level. The first step is securing the nation's borders and maintaining internal security. With the insurgency pushed into retreat, the government must strengthen its national defense and ensure that local militias are integrated into a more formalized and structured national security framework. This will help prevent the rise of any new insurgent groups and create a safer environment for rebuilding efforts to take root. The second step is restoring critical infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and schools must be rebuilt, and access to healthcare must be re-established across the nation. This will require substantial investment and long-term planning, but the people have already shown their commitment. Local workers, volunteers, and community leaders are ready to step in and help drive these efforts forward. The government must continue to leverage this grassroots support while securing international partnerships to bring in necessary resources. The third step is economic recovery. Agriculture, which has long been the backbone of Burkina Faso's economy, will need to be revitalized. This includes supporting farmers with seeds, tools, and training, as well as creating sustainable farming practices that are less vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The mining sector, while important, must be managed carefully to ensure that its resources benefit the people and contribute to the nation's long-term stability. Finally, the government must focus on governance and transparency. By ensuring that power is decentralized and local leaders are empowered to make decisions, Burkina Faso can foster a more resilient and accountable system. The people have already proven their strength, and it's now up to the government to maintain the momentum, ensuring that every Burkinabe citizen has a voice in the country's future. As the dust settled in Boule Dumuhune, the echo of the struggle for Burkina Faso's sovereignty could still be felt. The battle for the land was over, but the fight for the nation's future was just beginning. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership had sparked a transformation, not just in the military, but in the hearts and minds of the people. They had witnessed the return of their flag, the reclamation of their homes, and the restoration of their dignity. It was a powerful reminder that the struggle for independence and self-reliance was not just about survival, it was about reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. In Bonsa, a small village where the people had once lived in fear, the sight of the national flag waving in the wind brought tears to the eyes of many. It wasn't just a symbol of victory over the insurgents, it was a symbol of the resilience of the Burkinabe people. They had stood together, shoulder to shoulder, and fought not just for land, but for their right to live on their own terms. As the people of Burkina Faso begin to rebuild, they carry with them the lessons of the past, the importance of unity, self-reliance, and the unwavering belief that no matter the obstacles, they will rise again. The nation's sovereignty has been restored, but the journey toward true independence is just beginning, and for the people of Burkina Faso, this is only the start of a new chapter in their history. As the Burkinabe people look to the future, their journey is far from over. The battle for their nation's sovereignty has been won, but the real work lies ahead, in rebuilding homes, communities, and a country that has long been torn apart by violence and instability. The strength of Burkina Faso lies not just in its military or its government, but in its people. It is the farmers, the teachers, the volunteers, and the local leaders who have shown the world what it means to stand up for one's future. Now, as the nation moves forward, it is crucial that the world doesn't forget the courage and resilience displayed by the people of Burkina Faso. They are not just survivors of a war, they are the architects of their own future. This is a call to action, not just for those in power, but for every citizen, every individual who believes in the strength of unity and the power of self-determination. So let us ask, what can you do to support the ongoing journey of Burkina Faso? How can you help ensure that the resilience of its people continues to shine through, even as the challenges ahead remain? The future of Burkina Faso is in their hands, but it is also in ours.